Hello. What a great pleasure it is to be here with you at this festival. And what a huge honor it is for me to have this opportunity to offer for you a few remarks upon the occasion of the screening of this stunning documentary, The Six. The extraordinary team that brought this documentary to life could not have known that the completion of their film would coincide with the unfolding of a global pandemic. And along with this unprecedented mass death event, a surge in anti-Asian hatred across North America and many other parts of the world. However, this film is timely, not because of a coincidence or accidents of history. This film speaks so profoundly to our current moment because anti-Asian hatred is not new. It is not only a horrific byproduct of an already horrific global event. Anti-Asian hatred has a very long history. Anti-Asian hatred has been with us for as long as Asian migration has been with us. Part of what this documentary tracks is the way in which the story of Asian migration, and thus the story of anti-Asian hatred, is a part of so many stories that animate world history and the global imagination. The story of the sinking of the Titanic is deeply imprinted in the Anglo-American cultural imaginary. It is a historical event and a story that has been told over and over, not only in popular culture, but also within communities as part of family lore amongst survivors and others connected to the Titanic. But until this film, we didn't know that the story of the sinking of the Titanic is also a story of Asian migration. And until this film, we didn't know that the story of the sinking of the Titanic is also a story of anti-Asian hatred. This film recenters and redresses the experiences of Asian migration and the ways the aftermath of anti-Asian hatred shapes the stories we think we know. We think we know that the story of the Titanic is about the sinking of a ship on a terrible night. We think we know about the heroes and the cowards who are at the center of the Titanic story. And then, as we are about to do, we watch this documentary, The Six, and we learn that we must insist on new stories. We must insist on new stories about the stories we think we know. We must insist on new stories that uncover the histories and experiences of those who have little or no voice, whose lives were considered less valuable, and whose stories were made invisible and are almost lost to us. What a gift this film is, because it finds for us the stories that were on the edge of disappearance. The stories of the 6 Chinese survivors of the Titanic could so easily have floated away and sunk into oblivion. As you will see, it took tremendous perseverance on the part of the filmmakers to bring this story to us. I remain in awe of the staggering depth and rigor of the research that is at the core of the stories we see in this film. Every minute and every frame of this film comes out of meticulous research into Asian migration and family history that goes so far above and beyond anything I would have thought possible when I first talked to Arthur Jones on the phone about the film he and his team were making. I've been talking about stories, but of course, this is a documentary. Documentaries are about truth. And this film understands that getting to a true story, especially getting to a true story for peoples whose voices and lives have been persistently undervalued, demands a turn to a kind of fiction. Sometimes, getting to a true story demands imagining the story that is lost and reconstructing a story so that its truth can be revealed. As you will see, this film makes brilliant use of reconstruction, reconstructing events and spaces so that we can understand the truths that have been hidden. Let us watch this film and see in it the truth of the stories of the 6 Chinese survivors of the Titanic. Their stories deserve this telling. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, virtual KDocs audience, and a warm welcome to our special presentation of The Six. For those of you who don't know me, I am Janice Morris, and I am the founder and festival director of KDocs and the organizer of this very special social justice event. My pronouns are she and her. I'd like to open by giving thanks to the Kwantlen, the Musqueam, the Semiahmoo, the Tsawwassen, the Kakite, and the Coquitlam peoples on whose unceded and ancestral lands we are so privileged to study and live. Today, I join you from the traditional Musqueam territory. Tonight's event is part of our Fall 2021 series titled Stop Asian Hate, and we're so proud to present The Six, an extraordinary story of survival and dignity in the face of racism and anti-immigrant policies that still reverberates today. In organizing this event, we have been truly moved by the many personal stories shared by all of you, our guests. We hope you enjoyed the film and are ready to meet the people who brought it to life. A few quick guidelines before we get started. The Zoom chat is active, so you're more than welcome to join our fellow panelists and guests and post your comments and questions, some of which will be fielded to and answered by the panel. Please ensure that your mics are muted and that your cameras remain off for the duration of the event. Our session is being recorded and it will be posted on the KDocs YouTube channel called KDocs Talks very soon. Speaking of KDocs Talks, you might be interested to know that KDocs 2022 is just around the corner. Yes, our annual festival is in February, and I'll have more details to share about that at the end of tonight's event after the Q&A. But right now, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Michael Ma, a professor of criminology at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, and an activist scholar who researches issues pertaining to social justice, ethno-racial politics, community activism, and immigrant resettlement. Michael will introduce you to our panel and start the discussion and audience Q&A. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks so much, Janice. Thank you for such a warm welcome. And I'm so pleased to be here. It's such an important film. I watched it as well, as with our audience. And I'm so excited to be able to introduce 4 panelists that we have tonight. Our first panelist is Stephen Schwankert. He's one of the writers and co-creators of the film that we just watched. He's an explorer and a writer based in Beijing, and he's the co-creator and lead researcher of The Six, a book and a documentary film project that reveals the story of the RMS Titanic's Chinese passengers. So welcome to Stephen. Our second panelist is Arthur Jones. Arthur Jones is a British filmmaker based in Shanghai, China. His work includes the Poseidon Project, and A Farewell Song, the latter of which was backed by Channel 4's BritDoc Foundation, and it also won the Special Jury Prize for Documentaries at the Syracuse International Film Festival. And the third panelist that we have is Lily Cho, who you've just heard in the keynote. Lily is an associate professor of English at York University, where she's also the Associate Dean of Global and Community Engagement in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies at York University. Her research focuses on diasporic subjectivity within the fields of cultural studies, post-colonial literature and theory, and Asian, North American, and Canadian literature. And our fourth panelist is Sherman Chan. Sherman is the Director of Family and Settlement Services at MOSAIC. He has a Master's of Science in Applied Social Studies from the UK and is also a registered social worker. And he's worked in social service for more than 30 years around the world, in Canada, in Hong Kong, in the US, and in Britain. He also takes a leadership role on matters relating to immigration in Canada, and he's currently the co-chair of Corrections Canada Pacific Region Ethnocultural Advisory Committee, and also he sits on the Transit Police Chiefs Community Council here in Vancouver. So please, on behalf of the organizers, please help me welcome these panelists to our talk this evening. I realize I've just defaulted to the classic introduction when in fact we're not in a traditional venue, but welcome to all four of our panelists.
Thanks, Mike.
As Janice suggested, if you have questions, you can simply type them into the chat. But perhaps I can start off our questions this evening with a simple question, really. When I was reviewing the poster, I realized that in the poster, you know, the film is called The Six, but it seemed like in the poster also has the Chinese characters. You know, look, yeah, it says 6 people or 6 persons. And I was wondering if you could tell us something about the process of choosing the title, you know, for the film, and whether there must have been some debate about how to represent the incredible complex material with just a title, and what were the reasons for the English and the Chinese titles?
That's a great question, Mike. And a question I haven't been asked actually up to now, so that's very interesting. The title, The Six, was because Stephen and I, very early on, our feeling was that we were going to be focused on the 6 survivors. So I wanted a title, and I wanted a title that would hint at the mystery. So I didn't want a title that would give it away. I didn't want a title that was too filled with exposition. I wanted something that would hint at a mystery within this. I thought, you know, in terms of iconography, Titanic is such a bold image. I knew we would integrate it into posters. We'd use it in trailers and so on. I thought that would sort of pitch itself, if you like. And then I wanted to throw a title in there that would slightly disconcert you, you know, that you would think, how does that number relate to this? What is that? I'd always thought of faces, but it's very interesting because there were some changes. Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. So for a while, especially when we realized that there may be some information about the 2 that didn't make it as well, it was considered that we would move to the 8, or a suggestion was made. We didn't change for 2 reasons. One is that the 6 at that point, especially in China, had become a well-known upcoming film, if you like. So changing the title at such a late stage would have made it very confusing for everyone. The other was that there are certain, you know, comedians talk about funny words when they do stand-up. You know, you can say things in various ways, but certain words are just funny. And I always think there are certain words that just work really well in titles. And somehow the 6 always felt better in the mouth and in the delivery than the 8. And I also thought that, you know, saying the 6 meant that we could, you know, we could deliver that sort of extra surprise of it being kind of, oh, but they found something about the other 2 as well. So that was that. Interestingly enough, in China, the title was The Six in Mandarin, Liuren, for a long time, and it was just Liuren. Right at the last minute, our distributors, who were incredibly hands-off in terms of the way the film looked and so on, our theatrical distributors, said, can we add a sort of subtitle and put it in the title to explain? So it got a sort of subtitle in the title in Chinese. So it's called The Six, and then Titanic's Chinese Survivors. So that was put into the title. And once you do that and you get cleared for release in China, then it's not flexible. That's the name forever. So in China, we are The Six, Titanic's Chinese Survivors, in English with a 6.
Oh, it's so interesting. Thank you so much, Arthur. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I read a bit too much into it, because I thought when I saw, you know, 6 people, the two characters, I thought, oh, okay, there's some kind of suggestion that again, this anti-racism of these are people, these are six human beings, right? In that sense of kind of pushing that up front, which is different than saying,
well, there is a little of that in the Chinese. Of course, in English, there's no people in it. It's just the six. You can be a bit more oblique in English titles. Chinese film titles on the whole tend to be a little bit more direct, a little bit more explanatory. The other thing is number. I mean, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but numbered film titles are quite a thing, and they're quite a thing in China. One of the biggest, I think the most successful documentary ever released here was a film called 22, in Mandarin, which is about the Japanese comfort women during the Japanese occupation of China. And so numbers have a particular resonance, I think, even more in Chinese than in English. And what we didn't do is call it liu geren. We didn't put the measure word in the middle. We just called it liu ren, which the liu geren somehow felt a little prosaic in Chinese, and liu ren had a slightly more elevated sense that there might be something sort of special about these people. We're not just counting people. There's something about this particular six. But that may be my lack of subtlety in Chinese. But the title came up fairly early on, and I think the English and the Chinese were titles that Steve and I came up with. So we did that.
Wow, thank you so much. Clearly, you did think, you both thought very, very in-depthly about the title. There is a question. Thank you so much. There is a question where someone is asking, are there any interesting stories from the research that didn't make it into the documentary? And I'm thinking specifically of Stephen, because we of course see him on screen so much. There must be quite a lot, I imagine, that just didn't make it off the cutting floor, right? In that sense, that because of the length, there must have been certain things, Stephen, that were from the research that just didn't make it. Are there any things that you can, and Arthur, are there any things that you can share with us regarding research that didn't make it into the documentary?
I mean, I think in the current cut, the cut that everyone saw during KDocs is, there's a hint about stories that are sort of untold, or stories that were not told to their completion. And we do a little bit with the gentleman Albert who talked to us, and then we couldn't reach him, and then that kind of thing. I mean, part of the vetting process of what stories we were going to include, what part of the stories we were going to include, in part especially when we were dealing with potential descendants, the reality is they have to believe it. Even if we're convinced, if they're not convinced, then probably they're not going to participate. And it's, on the one hand, you would think that people would be very excited about the possibility that their ancestor was someone on Titanic. But I think also, especially in China today, there's a little bit of a worry that if you say something and it turns out not to be true, that you're going to look at minimum very foolish. If you say, well, this old family story that we've been, passing around the table, for years and years, that, our uncle, our grandfather, or whomever, excuse me, was on Titanic, and then it turns out not to be true, gee, then we're really going to look foolish. And I think also, the average person anywhere, whether it's China or Canada, United States, or wherever, the average person is just not accustomed to being part of a documentary. And so when a bunch of strangers show up and say, hey, tell us your story, we want to make a movie about it, and people don't really, well, what are you going to do with it? What are you going to, what's going to happen? Am I going to have any control over this? Am I going to get to see it before it goes out? Am I, and so, I mean, even I think you see it even with Marie Shum, where she said to Tom, she said, you're foolish, your father was never on Titanic. And that's, that's a story that's, absolutely solid. And even then they didn't believe it, even then it was like, but how could, and he never said, and, there were a lot of questions about it. So I think that part of it, it's, for us, what's interesting, I think what we think back on is not what you see in the film, but what you don't see, what we weren't able to include, either because we couldn't verify it to our own satisfaction, or we couldn't include out of respect for the families who they themselves just weren't sure that that their own story was accurate or truthful.
Well, let me follow that question up, Stephen, with a question about one of the passengers. I know one of the passengers that you investigate ends up in Calcutta. And I know there's, a pretty big Chinese community in Calcutta, or there was. I guess it's diminishing now. But were there any discussions about going to Calcutta to access those archives and that community? Because given the community at that time, there would have been a pretty, I suspect, a tight-knit community who may have known this migrant, right, in that sense. And I'm wondering if you and perhaps Lily, if you have any thoughts about that kind of diasporic question around resettlement and migration.
One of the single most difficult decisions that we have to make as part of a project like this is, when do we draw a line under it and say, that's it, we don't have more time or resources to devote to this? Or more specifically, we don't think that if we spend 30 more days on this, that it's going to generate the kind of results that we're looking for. I think there are any number of historians and would-be historians out there who have made something into their life's work that really didn't need to be their life's work, but they just don't know how to end it. They just don't know how to end that story. And more than anything, they just don't want it to end. It's become so much fun. It's become so consuming. It's become so much a part of their identity that they just simply can't say, all right, I didn't find it, or I didn't find that part of it, and I have to draw a line under this because I have to move on to something else. We didn't want to do that with this. We felt we had very compelling stories to tell, even if they weren't, 100% complete. And then also, on the more practical side, we had a distribution deal in China and therefore a deadline. But, you've just got to be realistic and say, how does this feel? Where do the leads point? If we hire someone in Calcutta, how likely is it that we're going to find somebody there? What do we think? And then you just kind of have to go with partly, where does the evidence point? And then partly, what does your gut say? Do we feel like something's going to happen here? So all those things sort of, contribute to a decision. I mean, I thought that was, a great story. But I think Paul, who you see in the film, and Grace and some other members of the team, I think we didn't see it pointing to some kind of more positive outcome or more comprehensive outcome.
We did actually, just to clarify, in Calcutta, we did dig a little in Calcutta. So the stories of the men who we know returned to Asia, that would be Alam or Lam Choi, and well, Ling He as well, but he's more complicated. Ling He is the Calcutta man. But we did a little. We looked. You might think that the records in India are comprehensive, mainly because, the one thing the Brits were good at, apart from messing up lots of other countries, was keeping records of it. You might think that, but in the case of Calcutta, we found only very limited shipping records, certainly shipping records that contained Asian names coming in. So we had a first pass, and we did that on everyone. I mean, there was nowhere where we just said, oh, we're not going to look. So we did that with those two, for Shanghai and Hong Kong, for Alam, and Calcutta for Ling He. And in both cases, there was nothing there was no low hanging fruit. Not to say it couldn't be found, but it would require a lot more resources to push into that. So yes, there were some things we left where they were, but there was nothing where we didn't just have a quick look under the stone, just to make sure there wasn't something obvious.
Great, thank you. I have a great follow-up question from one of our guests in the chat, from Justin. And Justin asked, quote, regarding the research team, it seems that you had the enviable resources to comb archives around the world. could you share a little about how you assembled and funded your team of researchers?
That's a great question. So when we started out, the research team included all of me and Arthur, and we just we had done that on our previous project, the Poseidon project, which was a documentary and a book, and worked well. We liked it. Our producer, who's also the producer on this film, Lo Tong, and Arthur's brother Luther was also involved, and we got a little help here and there, but for the most part, we were the ones that did the research. So we thought, all right, well, we'll bootstrap this one. That's fine. We did all right the first time, and even though our main subject was essentially the Titanic, we kind of missed the clue in the name that this was going to be a massive project, and we very quickly realized that we were going to need not just more people in terms of quantity, but we needed more specified experience. Arthur and I are both ex-journalists, and so we work with a certain toolbox, Google and interviewing people and so forth. But we realized that not only did we need genealogists and their toolbox and their knowledge of public records and their ability to pick away at people's steps through history, but we also needed them in specific places. We needed them in Canada, we needed them in the UK, we needed them in the US. We needed people with genealogical experience, working with Chinese family trees and so forth. And we just couldn't, do that ourselves. And we had so few threads to grab at when we started that we just realized we were going to need that kind of help. So, we took that where we could get it in the beginning. We had a few volunteers, some people who just thought we were, they liked the idea of what we were doing, and wanted to help out. And then also later on, once we got a distribution deal for the film in China, that gave us a little bit more budget to kind of work with, where we could say, okay, now we really need to focus here, there, and everywhere. And that's what led to the size of the team that we had.
Great, thank you so much, Stephen. I do have a question for Lily, also from our guests in the chat. The question for Lily is: now that we know how the story of the Six and how the story of the Titanic intimately blends with migration, anti-Asian racism, and experiences of Chinese migrants, how can we use this knowledge? How can we use this knowledge to address racism in a contemporary context, in contemporary modern society? How could we use what we've learned from the Six and the story of the Titanic and the anti-Asian racism and apply it to contemporary society?
Wow, that is a great question, and I could go on and on, but let me briefly say that I think one of the great joys of watching this film is, in fact, following the incredible research work that this team did. And one of the lessons that I take from it is the importance of doing that work of supporting the research that people like Stephen and Arthur are doing, doing your own research, reading, like watching this film is so profoundly important, and then following through your interest in those stories. And then in terms of applying it and thinking about it, one of the things that I am struck by over and over again when I think about the story of this film is how it tells a story that we think we know differently. And so I think that one way to apply that lesson, I think, is to think about the question, to think about a lot of the stories that you're living, and then think about what forms of discrimination and inequities make that story possible. So what are we not seeing that make the stories that are out there possible? And so there's so many dominant stories that are actually really dependent upon the deep discrimination of others in order to make it, in order to shine that light. And so I think I think that that is for me one of the really great lessons of the film is both the questioning of that story, the common story, but also the work behind it. You know, it's not just one thing to question it, but to actually really do that homework in terms of the questioning. And being a part of KDocs, I think, is such a great way of doing that. And being part of communities like the room that you're in right now is another really amazing way to do that, because you're meeting people who care, and you're going to talk to each other, and you're going to connect to each other, and you're going to form communities of inquiry where you're going to push for other stories and ask those questions. But thank you so much, and so eager to hear more from the rest of the panelists. So thank you.
Thanks, Lily. I'm wondering if I actually could redirect that question to Sherman in a sense, or a different form of that question, because it would seem like, you know, in terms of the film, there's quite a lot of discussion about family secrets and family past history and things that family prefer to keep hidden, you know. And so, Sherman, I'm wondering, you know, as someone who works in resettlement, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about, you know, this idea of hiding family history, and whether...
Or the hiding family history, I would say, is more of a surviving skill that people has to use it because of the environment that they are in. And I really appreciate when I watch the film, and at the end it talk about their intention, mention why they want to leave their home country and venture out. It talk about they know it is almost that will be like one-way trip. They may not be able to return, but then they have high hope. They have high hope for their future and the future of their family. It's talking about betterment of the children. So I can see that is really consistent with how we see not from China, but for many refugees, many immigrants around the world, they come to Canada because of that hope. And then, of course, in the context of history, we know there are different narratives during those times. Immigration or the Exclusion Act is really meant to make sure that no undesirable immigrants or people are entering into the land they thought that they possess. Of course, there's another story, or really looking at the whole Aboriginal and the indigenous community. But at this point, what I'm trying to say is that the narrative is starting to change, and I can see from nowadays when we work with immigrants, refugees, that is more of an emphasis of how they can contribute. And in fact, the film did really say how they contribute. They take on the job that nobody wants it. And it's quite reflective even now. And then with COVID-19, many of the refugees or migrant workers are taking on the job that are essential. We haven't thought about it, but now that is the case, that we want to make sure there are some venue, there are some pathway to residence, permanent residency can keep them because they are contributing. So I can really see, looking at the history and reflect to present day, is how we can really tell the story and narrative of their contribution and shifting the public narrative and the public idea about they are coming here, they are not coming here to take away the job. They are contribution, and there are many research and documentation and stories to tell that they are. So that is what I would say from what I've watched and how we can reflect and capitalize it to make it happen.
Thank you, Sherman. We actually have another question from one of our guests in the chat, Zoe Ann, who asked a question that really ties in, I think, to this issue of hidden truths or trauma or shame. And Zoe Ann asked the question, why do you think some of the survivors changed their names after their rescue? And this would be a question for Sherman and Lily, and also, of course, to the creators of the documentary.
Sherman, why don't you
Maybe
go
I can-
ahead? Or
Well,
Arthur,
I can I can see there are many new immigrants, they coming here, and then there are people locally would tell, because your name is so complicated. People cannot even pronounce or remember. It's better for you to make it simple and change the name. And that is for survival. And of course, another level of survival is that is the protection of who they are for whatever reasons that they have. But many of the new immigrants and refugees, that they want to make sure that even though they haven't changed the name, but they are using a name that people can easily remember and pronounce, and that they can mingle, they can become part of the society. That's my response.
I was going to add to this. Lily, actually, when we interviewed her, said something that it didn't end up in the film, but was very influential in the way that we thought about this. So I'm going to paraphrase here. I don't remember the exact words, but Lily said something along the lines of, when you have so little power, it's the small elements like your name, your age, perhaps the exact place you came from, that you can use to manipulate for yourself the situation that you're in. You can't throw money at the situation or use your connections usually. So if you're a sailor on a ship and you're trying to get into a country or settle in a country, then those tiny factors are things that you'll play with. But I'm sure Lily could say it better than I can say it. So you did say that, yeah, Lily. I'm not.
I did. Bless you,
misremembering
Arthur, for remembering that. You always make me sound so much smarter than I remember. But I did say that, and it's true, because part of my work has been about thinking about Chinese immigrant identities and why it was that so many people felt like they had to mask their histories and their names and their identities and their hometowns. I mean, my joke is that I can never remember when my father's birthday is, because he's changed it, 20 times on me over the course of the time that he's been my dad. And, and it's a survival tactic. I think Sherman is absolutely right. And it's very much about how you take power when there's very little power given to you. And so, many Chinese immigrants at a time, at this period in history, were being heavily surveilled. That's how we would think about them now. They were being tracked. They were being, they were being followed to make sure that they weren't violating a number of laws that were discriminating against them. And it was tremendously powerful, in fact, to be able to use a different name to evade certain restrictions or measures. And some of those false names became durable because they ended up on documents. And, so all of that just, again, and I want to bring it back to the film, speaks to what a tremendous achievement this film is, because you found your way through that. I mean, you really did. And it's just stunning, because very few people ever get around those labyrinthine, incredibly brilliant ways that many, many Chinese immigrants had in terms of navigating incredibly racist systems. But unfortunately, how they navigated it meant that it's now very hard to track that history. So bravo to Stephen and Arthur and your team for what you've done.
Great. Thank you, Lily. I've got a couple of questions about, again, the research, which I think the movie really pulls you into the intricacies of the research. So I have two questions for Stephen and Arthur. Number one, from our guests in the chat, they ask, would you have been able to find Fang Lang's story without his son, Tom Fong? And had you come across some other sources that showed him to be, Fong Wing's son? So there's that one question. And then the second one would be, again, about James Cameron. He appears in the film and he knows about the Chinese survivors, and because he filmed it, but then he ends up deleting it. And so the question from two different guests are, why was the scene deleted, and hence removing any kind of international perspective about the Titanic? So there's two questions for you.
I'll take a quick swing at both of those, and then Arthur can join in. I mean, how would we have told, or would we have known the Tom Fong story or the Fong Lang story if we hadn't met Tom Fong? I don't know. and I'm glad we didn't have to try to do it that way. I mean, we were, you know, what if you remember in the film, fairly early on, we meet Tom, and you know, we went out to Wisconsin, we met Tom, we're talking about it, and I think at the time I was much more skeptical of his story. I think Arthur is a generally kinder, you know, less skeptical person when it comes to, you know, that kind of interpersonal interaction. Plus, he had talked to Tom before on Skype or on Zoom, and so he had a little bit of interaction with him prior to that meeting. But you know, we're talking about it in the car. You know, I'm driving, and you know, it was, to me, it was key that, you know, I say in the film, you know, he clearly believes it, and to me that was important, because it meant that the story made sense to him, even though he didn't know a lot about it, and even though his mother told him he was a fool for thinking that, and so forth. So you know, and because the Fong Long story is what James Cameron is showing in that deleted scene, you know, those two things were very linked to us. I mean, first of all, Tom had never seen that scene before. We were sitting there in that living room and showing it to him off our computer or our iPad or whatever it was. But you know, in that sense, I think we just got lucky that guy happened to be Fong Long, that surname was preserved between, you know, somehow they recorded the actual name of that person. It wasn't kind of jumbled up the way some of the others were. In terms of Cameron, I mean, I think it's unfair to say that that he didn't have an international perspective, because if you go back and watch the film, if you look at the background, you know, forget Jack and Rose, but you know, look at the background of the film, you can really see that Cameron went out of his way to make sure that it was populated by Middle Eastern passengers and Eastern European passengers, and you do see a Chinese passenger. You know, there's only one of them, but you know, he does pop up from time to time in the background. So Cameron was clearly aware of the diversity of especially third class, and also you know, why was that scene deleted? It's just it inspired the Jack and Rose ending, but it's also too similar. So to have two people rescued off of, and then, you know, if you want to talk about, you know, should Kate Winslet have shared her piece of wood with Leo? I mean, you know, you've got Fong Long like balancing, you know, on that piece of wood in the deleted scene, and it's like, wow, there's a lot of buoyancy there, you know, and so clearly Leo's could have survived. But yeah, I mean, I'll hand over to Arthur at this point.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, I would second all of that. In terms of literally whether we could have worked out that Fong Long became Fong Wing's son without Tom, I think bear in mind, we're having a conversation here about research. I am not a maritime historian. I'm not a historian of the Chinese diaspora. Although it's tempting for me to constantly jump into the research, my role I view as being trying to construct this into a film. So in the background to this is always the question for me of, does this work as a film? This may be true, but is it interesting? Is this going to work in a dark auditorium with 200 people watching? You know, how do we not use or use music here? Is it in the scene? Is it diegetic? You know, those are the questions that I'm trying to think as we construct this. I think the key issue for me is that without Tom, I'm not convinced that we had a film. It's less the issue of was he Fong Wing's son? Could he help us to work out? You know, without him, could we work it out? On a sheer objective, could we work out that Fong Long was Fong Wing's son? I mean, the pieces were there. The question is, without Tom, could we have put it all together? In the end, the crucial document was a shipping record that placed Fong Long arriving in New York in 1920 in, I think, August, and then had Fong Wing's son in his A file, his alien file, I guess. A is alien, isn't it? I think so. The A file that we managed to get through a Freedom of Information request revealed that Fong Wing's son had claimed to arrive on a certain day in September of 1920 in New York, and the Fong Long that had been on board that ship that arrived in New York, it's called the Rondo, he just disappeared after that. He was not in ships after that. So between 1912, Titanic, and 1920, he was still around. 1920, he disappears. And Fong Wing's son claims to have arrived. So the pieces were there. I mean, that was the crucial thing. Stephen and I had talked for a long time about, you know, in the end, what proves the guy who died in the 1980s or 70s or whenever is the guy that was on Titanic. There are no photographs of them. So how are we going to match them up? And we sort of worked that out over time. So I think we could have done it factually, but my big thing would have been, I'm not sure we would have had a film. On Cameron, I just say one thing. We do occasionally get people, I think, slightly misunderstanding the story and saying it was so racist of Cameron to cut that scene. I mean, I would always make the point, Cameron made that scene. So he created the scene. He put it on the one edition of the DVD. It exists because of him. I think that I obviously can't speak for him, obviously, but I think that were Cameron to shoot Titanic again, his involvement in our film is a testament to the fact that I suspect he would probably foreground some of those stories more now than he would have done in 1997. I would only say that I think in 1997, he was already doing more than most would have done in Hollywood to tell those stories, to feature those faces, and so on. So I think Stephen's exactly right. I mean, we asked Cameron, and he confirmed that he cut it for sort of pacing and editorial reasons.
Thank you for that. That's so interesting. I have another question about really the backgrounds of the filmmakers, and I have a question here from Pip, who says, "I'm curious about the lead researcher's own background. How did he end up in China as a young boy?" And there's kind of a follow-up question to that, the question of race and racial background and racialization. Another question from our guests in the chat, quote, "What motivated the storytelling arc of the documentary, which starts and ends with the perspective of interested white people, including the dedication at the end of the film seeking to address the missing and lost stories of Chinese migrant experiences and intergenerational trauma?" So that I think is a interesting question. I'm wondering if you guys could answer the question from Pip and the other guest.
Well, I guess I'll take the first one. When I was, growing up, if I had to say what would I be talking about on a Zoom call when I'm, 50, I would have said the ocean, shipwrecks, maybe probably sharks, dolphins, whales. I was definitely headed towards marine biology, but I kind of fell out of love with it, in my early teens, and was kind of heading towards a journalism career. And my mother was attending a community college at the time, and her professor was organizing one of the first tour groups to China. And my mother was never a big traveler. And I said, "Ma, you got to go. You just got to go." And she said, "Why do I have to go?" And I said, "Because if I had the same chance, I would go. China, come on, And she said, "Oh, well, gee, if you're interested, then we'll both go." And so that was really, I had I grew up in a community that had a significant Chinese population among others. But I was always going to my friends' homes, and they were going to Chinese school on weekends. And, so to me, it wasn't unfamiliar. It wasn't weird to be around Chinese people growing up, and, to eat with chopsticks, or to, see walls adorned with calligraphy and so forth. And so, it was like, "Oh yeah, China. Okay, cool." And, my friends and especially their parents were very interested that I was going. They said, "Hey, if you get a chance, can you get me a bottle of, whatever, that is some sauce or something," and so, it was, but after that, what I realized while I was there was, wow, if you wrote about China, if you started a journalism career in China, you would never run out of things to write about. And needless to say, Arthur and I have proved that concept to the absolute hilt. 25 years later, we're both still doing China stuff. And, 25 years from now, I expect it'll be the same. So that's really, after that, my whole focus just shifted. I always loved the water and loved maritime history. But from there on out, it was just, how do I learn more about this place, and how do I learn the language? And, and then how do I get there? How do I get there to live there and start working and so forth?
I'll jump in on the second part, the slightly more contentious question. And I mean, this is such a hard question to talk about. I mean, the first thing I would say, I mean, we could talk about this for hours, but I mean, the first thing I would say is my take on these things as a documentary maker is and this may sound overly sort of pushing back on the question, but I don't think it's any one individual's job to challenge the structures. And I know the question didn't have this necessarily built into it, but the question of Stephen and me or Cameron or others being white in this film and telling the story. My first thing to say is I don't think it's any one individual's responsibility to sort of fix that issue or to overturn it. I think a lot of these issues are structural. In this case, I guess the question for Stephen and I would have been, since Stephen and I are a team and friends and have known each other for a long time, would it have been better to not tell the story or to pass it on to someone else? We actually, I think, are sort of, without wanting to blow our own trumpets, kind of uniquely qualified to work on a film like this because we're both Chinese speakers. We've been in China for decades. I certainly, I'm sure Stephen is close to this, but I think last year I'd spent more than half my life in China. And therefore, we both have access to Chinese records, great teams in China, and also, grew up, backgrounds in journalism. We know a lot of historians. Stephen has a great Titanic background. These are the things that we could bring into this. I think the question is interesting. I mean, bear in mind that Stephen and I have been based in China for this long time. This question did come up a couple of times. Stephen and I, in fact, raised this a couple of times early on and said, is this problematic? I mean, the thing that's interesting is that some of these issues we talk about are not necessarily universally talked about the same way all over the world. So within China, for example, the predominant reaction we get that refers to our background is that there's a sense of like, how come Chinese people online in comments, in panels and so on will often say, how come we never told this story before? We're so grateful for you guys, which is strange because, of course, we don't necessarily feel like you guys from the outside. We're just people who live here and are telling the story. The other thing I should say is that despite the fact that Stephen is at the sort of the heart of my film, and I tell a lot of it through Stephen's experience, the team is probably in numbers more Chinese than not. Our producer is Chinese, our main editor is Chinese. More than half of our research team was Chinese in China, and that were a lot of people with Chinese backgrounds or Asian backgrounds. So without wanting to either sound too defensive or otherwise, I mean, we are who we are as individuals, and we got to tell the stories that turn up in front of us. I think the structural question of whether not whether, I mean, obviously there is a problem with representation, who tells these stories, I think is something that that platforms and people with bigger remits than us have to think about.
Thank you so much. Those are provocative answers. We're coming up to 8 o'clock, and so maybe we have time for just a final round of questions. And I've got 3 questions here that I will ask as a group, and then maybe the panelists can take them as a group. There's a couple that are linked. One is the question about whether you pursued the Canadian survivors' family, the ones that moved to Toronto. So that's, I guess, a simple question. The second question is related to that in the sense of they're wondering if you pursued or looked into the journey from in the Caribbean to Cuba, right? You mapped this transatlantic crossing and North American land crossings and so on and so forth. But could you say more about the decision to focus less on this leg of the trip? I think that's the second question. And then the last question is really a question about, again, from our guests in the chat, about funding. Did most of the funding come from China? And in doing your research, did you find much reluctance from archives and museums in letting you access these records?
I'll just answer quickly on the first two. I mean, as far as the Canadian survivor, Li Bing, I mean, we did pursue it, and actually we pursued it not in Canada, but we pursued it in China because we had somebody who presented themselves as a, fairly confident in the story and so forth. But that initial confidence kind of fell apart over time. And then it was very much like the story that's shown in the film, where the person came out in the beginning, was like, oh yes, I'd be happy to talk about this. And yes, we know all about this and so forth. And then over time, as I think the family discussed it more internally, they were less and less sure of the veracity of it. And they didn't feel comfortable talking to us about it. And we did have one kind of an interview, and we weren't sure what to make of it, and I think they weren't sure what to make of it, and that was about as far as it went. But I'm still, to me, there's still a part of that piece that's missing. I've always thought of the six as, especially for everybody who's been in lockdown for the last year, that 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle that you did on a card table in your living room to pass, the lockdown time. Well, imagine taking all the pieces to that and just kind of scattering them all over the world. And that was basically our task, was to start forming the edges of that and so forth. So that means that there are a lot of pieces that we didn't find. And I think, I hope that, to go back to the previous question, I don't think Arthur or I are saying that this is the last word on the Chinese passengers on board Titanic. It's I don't know if in Canada you had the Leonard Nimoy program In Search Of back in the 70s, but they always kind of framed it as saying, we're offering possible, plausible explanations to the mysteries that we explore. And I think it's the same thing, the same thing is true here. And I really hope that other people will pick up where we left off and take it forward and make new discoveries. And I don't think Arthur or I fear being proved wrong. So in terms of what was the second question? I'm sorry. It was also research based.
There was a question about Cuba.
Cuba, right. I mean, we really looked hard at Cuba in the beginning. We really thought that was, that at least one of the men would have kind of gotten to Cuba or gotten to the Caribbean and said, hey, I'd rather be an indentured servant in Cuba or in Jamaica than do another one of these voyages. I mean, we almost just lost our lives on the sea, and forget this. And like, everybody here speaks Toisan, and it's just like being in southern China, and forget it. I'm off this ship. But the evidence just wasn't there. There was a little bit of documentation with some similar names, but we weren't convinced. And I think the shipping records also kind of showed us that wasn't really the way things were going. The shipping records are pretty good. They did a pretty good job of pointing the way to, where these men went when they started to break up, what their relation was to each other. And I think that's why we ruled it out. But again, just like Calcutta, Cuba has a very small but sort of concentrated Chinese community even today. And, those records could be there, maybe, that's something that'll pop up, once the film has had its run.
Thank you. And there was that final question around funding. I don't know if you wanted to address that.
I don't mind answering that. Yeah, funding, we were very lucky. I mean, essentially, independent films like this don't usually get funding up front. So, so we put in, I think, a couple of years' work before we had this extraordinary experience of we'd made a trailer, and we had the Facebook page at that point, which incidentally proved very useful. The Facebook page became a real conduit for people to, we made it actually looking for descendants. So we were using that to sort of reach out, and we'd put a trailer on there, a sort of early teaser for the film, and it got shared on Weibo, the Chinese social media platform. And overnight we had, I think, 20 million plus views. I mean, literally overnight. And for a whole day, we were the top trending story in China. And in the wake of that, our producer Lortong was contacted by a number of theatrical distributors. So it's a very unusual situation. It didn't go to TV. We went immediately down the theatrical route, the cinematic route. and eventually a deal was made, and the production company LP Films, that is Lotong's production company, initially funded us when they joined us, and then it became our distributor in China, who essentially covered a large portion of the costs.
Thank you so much, Arthur. I think our guests in the chat will be thankful for that answer. So we're past 8 o'clock, and we typically don't go for over an hour, but I just wanted to ask one final question from the chat for Sherman. And the question is from Diana. And she says, quote, "I'm wondering whether there are groups in the Vancouver area who would be interested in continuing conversations about anti-Asian racism in light of this film," right? And also it also dovetails with another question from Gerald, which might go back to the producers and the makers of the film. Are there plans to release it for a general viewership? So first,
there are groups. I have to say that there are many groups, and basically through the BC government, there is a program called Resilience BC, and there is the End Racism and Hate Network. So each city have a network or an organization who take it on using a hub and spoke model. That means that an agency will work with community groups, and in Vancouver, Collingwood Neighborhood House hosts the network, and in Burnaby, that is the Burnaby Family Life hosts the network. So there are many organizations there that could initiate discussion, and I've seen some discussion already starting about anti-Asian hate. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Sherman. And Arthur or Stephen, distribution, and can you tell us a bit about that?
Distribution is sometimes people ask us and they're like, have you thought about, have you thought about playing it here? We'd love to take it everywhere. We'd love to run everywhere where there's an audience for it. I mean, right now we're on a beginning of a theatrical run in the UK. So, I mean, miracles do happen. It'd be lovely to be able to take this on a wide cinematic run in Canada as well. We'd love that. We have a distribution company, one in China, one outside of China, and they're beginning to roll it out. In fact, it has it's gone to TV in Australia and Spain, I think in Hong Kong. I'm missing one, there's somewhere else. But we'd love to bring it to Canada. For those who are interested, I would say, if you want to help us on that road to that becoming more possible, it'd be great if you enjoyed the film. The big thing is just to show people that it's something you enjoyed. Go on IMDb, put a rating on there, write a review. The distributors notice that kind of thing. If there's lots of people saying they enjoyed the film, they'll see that, and we can use that as a reason to bring it out. And if anyone wants to suggest screenings and so on, it is possible for us to set them up on a sort of one-by-one basis. We have someone in Shanghai who's sort of in charge of that, and they've done various screenings around the world for individual groups. If you know 50 or 100 people who could come together and would like to watch it that haven't had a chance to see it so far, these are things that it is possible to organize those things.
Well, one of our guests, Peter, in the chat is already demanding a sequel called The Eight. So, so you have quite a lot of fans.
I like
in
that.
This room.
Well,
I like that. We'll stick with the numbers. Yeah.
Okay. So sadly, we're at 8:10, and so we're really past our hour. So on behalf of the organizers, I really want to extend my thanks to Lily and to Sherman and to Arthur and to Stephen. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been so provocative and so eye-opening. Thank you for a lot of the behind the scenes and the insider knowledge about the production. So thank you so much. It's been great.
Thank you, Mike.
Yes, on behalf of KDocs, thank you to Lily. It's now past 11 in Toronto, so thank you. And thank you to Sherman and Stephen and Arthur for sharing your stories, your experience, your impressive body of work, and of course your expertise with us here tonight. I'd also like to extend sincere thanks to my colleague and friend, our moderator, Michael Ma, who did such an outstanding job fielding a lot of really good questions. And on that note, thank you to our virtual audience for joining us to celebrate this documentary and all that it represents. In the handout that went out to you via email on the last page, there are a number of resources that you can follow up with. And the Facebook page for the Six is also an excellent resource if you want to carry on further discussions and talk about further resources. And so before we go, I just want to say to all of our guests, be sure to join us in the new year. It's just around the corner, February 18th to 27th, KDocs 2022, our annual film festival. We'll be showcasing over 20 award-winning films just like this one on all kinds of issues of social justice, anti-racism, anti-oppression, a number of outstanding films, keynote addresses, panel discussions, just like this one and much more. So learn all about it at KDocsFF.com or at KDocsFF on social media. And until next time, my friends, I just want to say that I wish you all a very safe, healthy, and happy holiday season. When in doubt, always choose kindness. Have a good night.